Welcome to one of my favorite spaces in the Graduate Center. Beautiful view outwards. I hope the expansive window outward reflects the expansive nature of our discussion tonight. My name is Joy Connolly. I'm the interim president of the Graduate Center, and I want to welcome you here and to one of the first major events of our public programming this spring. It's a great pleasure to have you here. I want to say a couple things about the Graduate Center as a school, and then I'll turn to the theme before us for discussion tonight, and then finally a brief introduction of our speakers and our moderator. The Graduate Center, for those of you who haven't spent much time here before, is a leading research institution in the country. It's the only R1 institution, Research 1 institution at the City University of New York, and it's one of the most diverse doctoral institutions in the country. We produced over the last 10 years, we're the second highest number of doctorates to Latinx students. That's just one example of the diversity of students, of our student community that we're so proud of. A key part of our mission at the GC is to wrestle with pressing issues of the day through public conversations like this one that tackle some of our toughest problems of urban life, of global life, culture, economics, society, the arts, the sciences. We span the range. This spring, we're bringing some of our most thoughtful writers and scholars and scientists together in our public programming. You should come back, I hope, to hear the New Yorker editor David Remnick, the physicist Freeman Dyson. We're going to be, that's just two examples, we're going to be focusing on everything from Frederick Douglass to the role of a free press in a democracy to questions of quantum physics that I won't try to describe in brief. So I really hope to see you here at future events. Tonight, we're focusing on higher education with a question being put to our panelists: is higher education for everyone? And I'm brought to mind in thinking of this idea posed as a question of a similar question posed by Mariette Westerman, the vice president of the Mellon Foundation, at an event she hosted about a year ago, bringing together community college leaders and research university leaders. And she said very bluntly and very clearly, as a call to all of us to think hard, how equal do we want higher education in the United States to be? We have choices here. We can make decisions to make it more or less equal, more or less accessible. So where do we want, as a country, where do we want the future of higher education to go? I want to acknowledge our co-sponsors for the event before I say a little bit more about it. First, the Futures Initiative, and you may hear a little bit more about that from our panelist, Cathy Davidson, sitting at the end. The PhD program in urban education, and the Stone Center on Socioeconomic Inequality. Thanks very much to those co-sponsors for your presence here tonight, your bringing in of multiple audiences, and your support. So what will we look at tonight? I hope, without making too many promises on the part of our panelists, I'll say that we plan to look at issues or questions such as these. How do we achieve equity in higher education? And what are the forces that prevent us from doing so, especially at public institutions like this one? What are the complex issues facing universities that hinder us from moving forward? And tonight, as I say, we look at these challenges throughout higher education, but we're especially interested here on graduate education. And that's unusual for a panel like this, because questions of access and equity tend, for obvious reasons, to focus on undergraduate education. But tonight, I hope we gain some insight into the graduate world. We're, of course, taking this initiative and exploring these questions because the GC is a school focused on doctoral and master's education, and we like to think, and more than think, we plan and design our curricula around the project of preparing students for careers inside and outside academia to tackle the world's toughest problems. Recently, too, we began pursuing a new initiative in understanding ourselves better as an institution, with a new initiative in critical university studies, an innovative field that explores the role of higher education, especially, again, public universities, at the intersection of issues of race and class and gender, culture, political economy, and politics. Our Advanced Research Collaborative, or familiarly known in the building as ARC, is at the forefront of formulating research in this area and has fellows studying in this topic this year. So tonight, I'm proud and happy and excited to hear from our panelists, and I'll turn to them now, a group of two true luminaries in this area, renowned scholars and innovative thinkers. And I'm proud to tell you that 4 of our panel members make their home here at the Graduate Center. Let me start with Stephen Brier, our moderator, professor of urban education and founder of the Graduate Center's Interactive Technology and Pedagogy program. He's an expert in class and labor issues in education and fairly recently co-authored the book, Austerity Blues, Fighting for the Soul of Public Higher Education. Next to him is Richard Reeves. We're delighted to welcome back to the Graduate Center. Richard is a senior fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institution, where he's also co-director for the Center on Women and Families. He's the author, most recently, of Dream Hoarders, How the American Upper Middle Class is Leaving Everyone Else in the Dust, Why That's a Problem, and What to Do About It. Carla Shedd, in the middle of our group, is Associate Professor of Sociology and Urban Education. Her book, Unequal Cities, Race, Schools, and Perceptions of Injustice, about the obstacles facing urban adolescents in Chicago, has been called, and I quote, a revelatory study that should be required reading for anyone who wants to understand the relationship between inequality and urban education. And I can't resist underlining, because it's a book I know well, it's wonderfully readable, along with, not in spite of, its scholarly weight and heft. Sakina Laksimi-Morrow, a fellow at the Graduate Center's Teaching and Learning Center, offers us an essential perspective, that is, the students. She's a doctoral student in the Urban Education program and in the Interactive Technology and Pedagogy Certificate program. Sakina works with other grad students who are interested in developing a socially conscious pedagogy. And lastly, but not least, Cathy Davidson, Distinguished Professor of English and Director of the Graduate Center's Futures Initiative. Cathy's expertise in pedagogy and innovation is the focus of her latest book, The New Education, How to Revolutionize the University to Prepare Students for a World in Flux. It details the huge challenges to obtaining a college education in this country, while it presents promising solutions, too, for improving higher education, including programs at CUNY's own LaGuardia Community College. So it's quite a row of stars, and I will now turn the floor over to them. Please join me in welcoming moderator Professor Steve Brier and this distinguished panel.
Thank you, Joy. Welcome, everybody. I hope we'll have a stimulating and interesting conversation tonight about some very large and important topics relevant to higher education in this country and elsewhere. In my brief introductory comments tonight, I want to do 2 things. Briefly define the meaning and broad parameters of critical university studies, or CUS, a new interdisciplinary field of inquiry and analysis we have recently launched at the Graduate Center, which helped generate the idea for tonight's panel. And second, perhaps broaden the question for this panel to what is the purpose of higher education and how central are public university systems like CUNY in answering this question. First, let me define critical university studies. CUS examines the role, as you heard from Joy, of higher education, I would argue especially public universities, at the intersection of issues of race, class, gender, culture, political economy, and politics. Growing out of the theoretical and interdisciplinary developments in the fields of cultural studies and critical legal studies, CUS examines the institutional structures and ideologies that define public higher education systems. The CUS field has grown over the past decade at a range of public universities, including in the University of California and CUNY systems, as well as internationally. A number of CUNY scholars, including faculty and doctoral students at the Graduate Center, are currently working on or have worked on CUS projects, including, as you've heard, members of this panel and members in the audience as well. CUS research subjects and areas of interest include, but are not limited to, the political economy of governmental funding of public higher education and the negative impact of public budget cuts and rising tuition costs, especially on students of color and poor and working class students, the history of public university systems, nationally and internationally, frankly, a woefully underdeveloped field of inquiry. I say this as a historian of education, especially with respect to our own institution, CUNY, which has no general history written of it. Analyses of who gets admitted to public university, for example, theories of meritocracy versus equality and open access, and the impact of those conflicting ideologies on the historical and contemporary makeup of public university student bodies and faculties. Transformations in what is taught in college classrooms, including the creation of alternative pedagogies and fields of scholarly inquiry, for example, ethnic, gender, sexuality studies, the digital humanities, and related narrowing of existing curricula of what is considered appropriate or acceptable. For example, the current obsession with STEM subjects to the exclusion of arts and humanities subjects. The dramatic growth in administrative hiring costs and business practices in public universities, neoliberal attacks over the past 4 decades on public institutions in general and public universities in particular by politicians and business interests intent on privatizing public goods like higher education, the dramatic rise of contingent or adjunct academic labor and its impact on the structure, function, and very purposes of higher education, especially public higher education, and oppositional responses of college faculty, staff, undergraduate and graduate students, and the larger communities they serve to the funding cuts and the fiscal disciplining faced by public higher education systems around the country. This rich and diverse array of areas of inquiry has been fully interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary, employing innovative and creative humanities and social science methodologies to document, analyze, and interpret the changing structures and functions of public universities. Why study universities at all, let alone public ones? 2 basic facts should be noted here. The number of students currently enrolled in U.S. higher education institutions approaches 23 million, nearly 3/4 of whom attend public institutions like CUNY. And the total annual expenditure on higher education in the United States exceeds $560 billion, about 2/3 of that total at public institutions. Higher education is a very big and important business that helps shape and give meaning to our very lives. It deserves the scrutiny that CUS offers, Critical University Studies offers. The history of our own institution, CUNY, richly illustrates many CUS themes and areas of interest that I've detailed above. And let me, you promised me an icon, and I'm not seeing it. There you go, thank you. I'm putting the CUNY Digital History Archive that I and colleagues here at the Graduate Center helped to develop for people who are interested in learning more about CUNY's history. I won't use it, but I just wanted you all to see it and know about it. The original New York City municipal college system was created in 1847 with the founding of what would later become City College. The city's commitment to public higher education, overwhelmingly supported in a referendum of taxpayers, was, quote, to educate the children of the whole people gratuitously, which is to say tuition-free, a commitment that lasted almost 130 years before it was finally brought to an end during the 1976 New York City fiscal crisis. But free tuition for full-time CUNY students was not quite the same thing as opening wide the entry doors of the municipal colleges and later CUNY, which was formally created by state law only in 1961, to open those doors to all of the children of the whole people. Over the course of the first century and a quarter, CUNY became increasingly more difficult to get into and far less reflective of the changing demographics of the city's population. In 1968, for example, with the civil rights movement in full flower in the North and the South, Brooklyn College remained 96% white at a time when African Americans and Puerto Ricans already comprise nearly half the graduates of New York City's public high schools. What changed CUNY forever, and for the better, I would argue, was the spring 1969 uprising of Black and Puerto Rican students across the CUNY system, who not only challenged CUNY's restrictive entrance requirements, but also argued for more active responses to the educational needs and identities of entering students. Students of color, along with white student and faculty allies, occupied many of CUNY's senior and community college campuses during the 1969 spring term. By doing so, they forced CUNY administrators and city and state politicians to concede three important things that fundamentally transformed not only CUNY, but public education nationwide. First and foremost, they demanded open admissions to CUNY for all New York City high school grads in order that CUNY student population more accurately reflect the city's and the public schools' actual racial and ethnic composition. And their demand was no grades, no limitation of high grades or SAT scores. They answered the question posed in the title of tonight's event with a resounding yes. But the other two outcomes of the 1969 open admissions struggle also answered the other question I posed at the outset, namely, what is the purpose of higher education? The CUNY strikers demanded support for the SEEK program, which is an acronym for Search for Education, Elevation, and Knowledge, that provided much needed remedial support to graduates of the New York City public high schools who were often woefully underprepared to begin college-level work when they entered CUNY. SEEK, by the way, is still going almost 55 years later, and proudly so in many of the CUNY campuses. Open admissions was simply not enough. CUNY students demanded needed educational support services as well. And second, and perhaps as importantly, the 1969 CUNY Student Rebellion led to the founding of a series of Black studies and Puerto Rican studies programs, centers, and institutes across the CUNY system after 1970, which helped pioneer new approaches to scholarly inquiry and pedagogy that still resonate in our own time and are still relevant in our own time. These pioneering efforts also helped launch subsequent women's, gender, LGBTQ studies programs and research centers, not only across CUNY, but also at universities, public and private, across the country. To expand fields and forms of scholarly knowledge and inquiry was a third indelible outcome of the 1969 student struggle for open admissions. It became fashionable to degrade and diminish the efforts and accomplishments of the student rebels at CUNY over the next 3 decades, both in the immediate aftermath of the implementation of CUNY's pioneering open admissions policy in fall 1970, and in its final unraveling by the Giuliani administration in 1999. I think, on the contrary, the struggle for open admissions at CUNY and all that changed in its wake is worth remembering, a vital moment in the rich history not only of CUNY, but also of public universities generally that we should rightly study and celebrate. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's a real privilege to be on a panel, and such a distinguished panel. It also allows me to indulge one of my favorite and private fantasies, which is to be a faculty member of the CUNY Graduate Center. So just for tonight, can I pretend? The question is higher education for everybody? My answer to that is yes, or it darn well ought to be, but in different ways for different people. So specifically, I'm going to talk about public education, but I'm going to leave for the discussion how we determine the line between public and private, because the number that Steve just gave us, the thing that stuck with me is not that 2/3 of that 560 billion goes to publics, but 1/3 of it goes to privates. And as Larry Bacco, the president of Harvard, said in an event that we held a couple of weeks ago, they are also reliant on public support. So I think it's helpful to think about private institutions perhaps as quasi-public institutions. But most of my attention will be focused on public institutions specifically. And I think that they can, is it just a down arrow? Yeah. I think there are three ways in which we should think of higher education being for everyone. As an educational institution, we educate, and particularly educate in a way that will hopefully increase opportunity, and that's what I'll spend most of my time on, but also as anchor institutions in specific communities, working with and for those communities. And then thirdly, as research institutions, especially research institutions like this one, producing public goods in the form of their research, which benefits society as a whole and increase the general welfare. So I think if we think about being for everyone in those three different ways, that's be the main structure of my talk. But I'm going to focus, partly because it's the area I know most about, on the issue of access. And Joy's right that most of the attention is on undergraduate admissions. That's for two reasons. One, because that's where the best data is. And secondly, because conditional on undergraduate success, actually the class gap in moving on to graduate studies is much less than the gap there is in access to education in the first place. So if we start with, all the data I'm going to show you is from Opportunity Insights, who are partnering with the Stone Center on an exciting conference, who I work with very, very part-time, led by Raj Chetty out of Harvard, using anonymized tax records. And I won't have time to dwell on each of these charts, so I want to use them instead to kind of make some key points. The line you can see diagonally here is the relationship between your parents' income growing up and your income as an adult. Very strong correlation, as you can see. But then the lines you can see above that are for those who at the top go to an elite four-year institution, a four-year institution, and then a two-year institution. The fact that those lines, especially at the top, are higher than the other one tells us that people who go to and through institutions of higher education do better. That's not breaking news. The fact that they are almost flat, not quite, but almost flat, suggests that conditional on going to and through those institutions, the class gap doesn't disappear, but it's certainly massively diminished. And so it is true that conditional on that, conditional on going to and through, actually education, and higher education in particular, is a great equalizer. It is, as Horace Mann said, the great equalizer. But then the problem is this, same data. This shows you your parents' income from left to right, poorest on the left, richest on the right, and then your chances of enrolling in college between the ages of 18 and 21. So that doesn't include mature students. But nonetheless, it is a striking correlation. Because they have such big data set, you'll also notice that there are no real error terms. They put a line of best fit through it, but you know how social scientists sometimes have like all those dots, and then they put a regression line through it, and you're squinting at it going, really? Well, they did it here as well, but I can agree they didn't really need to. And as the social scientists in the room will notice, the coefficient you can see there tells us that we can predict your chances of enrolling in an institution of higher education with 2/3 accuracy by knowing your parents' income. It is simultaneously one of the most important, elegant, and terrifying charts I've seen in recent social science. So great leveler in theory, great stratifier in practice. And let's look at where people go. And here it's the same data, and I've said of those who go to college, poorest fifth on the left, richest fifth on the right, and then the middle 60 in the middle of the chart. And the basic message here is you see very big differences in the kind of institutions that are attended by those from different income backgrounds. For those who are from households at the middle 60% of the income distribution, the middle class, if you like that definition, the modal institution is a 2-year community college, followed by 4-year public. Relatively non-selective public access. So that's where middle-class American kids actually go to college. The question is, how do they do? Well, let's look at CUNY for a moment just to kind of make the point, and this data actually is well known within the community here because CUNY does so well from the Chetty studies. And so some of this isn't news to all of you, but let's just see in terms, this is the whole CUNY system now, right? So this is all the colleges put together and weighted for the size. You know, where do their students come from? What you can see is their students come from the bottom of the distribution to a really high degree. So really serving the public and serving as what one college professor likes to call the top or the bottom 100% of the distribution. So a public serving institution. Then what happens to those students? Well, this tells me of the students who come to CUNY, how many move up a certain number of quintiles. Now quintiles is just 20% of the distribution. So how many of them move up? If there's 5 rungs on the income ladder, how many who come in move up at least 1? Well, you can see 60% move up 1, 40% move up to down to 7% who can move 4. By definition, you can only move 4 if you're going from the bottom to the top. So that number's going to come down anyway. These are very high numbers by comparison to most institutions in the US. And then just to make it even clearer, you saw the distribution in dark blue before, 1 minute, where students came from, and then in the income distribution, and then where do they end up? So the dark blue tells me what rungs of the income ladder were they on in terms of their parents' income, and the light tells me, as graduates from CUNY, where do they end up on the distribution? So it's the pre and the post distribution. So if you like, that's the extent to which an institution like CUNY can actually move people up the income ladder very strongly. But having said that, and these are my final points, I don't want to lose sight of the other two things I hope we'll talk about today. An anchor institution, serving its community through open doors, public spaces, access to events like this, and through your procurement policies and engagement within the community. As a research community, especially with your graduates, doing high quality work that has impact on public policy and public opinion. And all in all, for a public institution, in terms of being for everyone, what that means is it has to be infused with a spirit of publicness. Putting the public into public education means being public in all of the ways I've just described, in the community, in the impact that you're trying to have with your research, and in the kind of students you serve and how they go on to prosper in life. So in that sense, higher education has to be for everybody, or I wonder why we have it at all. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. As a sociologist who studies the interactions of people with public institutions that can combat or exacerbate inequality, such as schools and courts, I am intrigued by the power of these formative social structures, watching ever vigilantly how institutional promises are made, sometimes broken, and ultimately, we hope, fulfilled. Today's discussion of whether higher education is for everyone must consider whether education, full stop, is for everyone. This is why I study young people who sit at the precipice of moving onward through secondary education to college, or who are pushed out from school toward correctional institutions. I want to show you two images from two different eras in American urban education. The first is from 1957, which illustrates the now iconic moment of National Guardsmen protecting Central High School's newest enrollees from angry crowds of white parents and students who did not want to see their school racially integrated. The second photo shows a scene over a half-century later, outside of Fenger High School in Chicago, Illinois, a scene that has become more and more common in American urban education. In contrast to the first photograph, in which the guards are protecting the students from the anger of the larger community, the officers outside of Fenger High School on the south side of Chicago are posted to protect African American youth from the violence they perpetuate against one another. Students who were once seen as a group that needed societal protection can now commonly be seen as the problem. The formation and transformation of public schools in unequal cities, like New York and Chicago, powerfully shaped the social and cultural lives of their students, constructing their institutional selves in two ways. One, high school as a portal to higher education may be the primary reason why young people leave their neighborhoods, or high school may be a reason why they never leave their neighborhoods. And two, youth will experience the long reach of the law via the incursion and embeddedness of police officers in schools, depending on the demographics of those same schools in urban environments. Schools also shape their charges by enabling their social, intellectual, and emotional development, and in ways not often defined, prepare them for the experience of being an adult. So this is the education part. School is therefore an essential developmental setting, which in many ways purports to serve as a microcosm of the community and the larger social world. However, as I argue in my book, Unequal City, Race, Schools, and Perceptions of Injustice, schools do not reflect the world in which we live. Instead, schools serve to further distort social worlds in an unequal society. Therefore, schools, which should be an equalizing force in American society, are instead more likely to reproduce and further distort existing social stratification by race, gender, class, neighborhood, and many other features. This is especially true in the places that I now study, like New York City, and even Poughkeepsie, where I was earlier this afternoon, where changes accompanying educational and residential segregation in these cities are often played out through law enforcement touching the lives of those young people. Schools are now more segregated than they were during the era of Jim Crow. For instance, Chicago public schools are about 8% white, with many of the white students clustered in magnet schools. New York City is at the top of several segregation indices for their public schools. So these are the pipelines to higher education. What do they look like? Due to the overwhelming predominance of Black and brown bodies in these institutional settings, it is more likely, I argue, that a criminal gaze and a universal apparatus of criminality and carcerality is turned inward. Therefore, it's turned on to the students rather than a purportedly dangerous public if you think about the police in these spaces and who are they protecting young people from. As schools and neighborhoods have become more securitized in this era of mass incarceration, these young people end up on what I call a carceral continuum instead of a school-to-prison pipeline. The carceral continuum, which allows you to think about the points of entry, progression through, exit from, re-entry to spaces of social control and carcerality. And how do we end up on the carceral continuum? Let's go to Brooklyn, where the incursion or presence of criminal justice intervention is so intense that a jail-themed playground remained on the grounds of the Tompkins Public Housing Project in Brooklyn for 6 years until media attention stirred public outrage in 2010. Therefore, the research I do exposes the mechanics of America's failure to achieve the ideals of true democracy in the realm of education because of the penetration of criminal justice. One could argue this failure is largely due to the persistence of racial segregation, what sociologists Massey and Denton call the, quote, institutional apparatus that supports other racially discriminatory processes and binds them together into a coherent and uniquely effective system of racial subordination. If racial segregation is the institutional apparatus that undergirds white supremacy in America, then I posit that the public domains where this subordination is manifest, our neighborhoods, as you can see, our schools, and our courts that I study, will indelibly mark the individuals that are encased in these spaces. My current project on the juvenile court system in New York City allows further exploration of this idea of a pipeline. Instead of a pipeline to the higher education system, unfortunately, it is a pipeline leading to correctional institutions. I'm hoping we can think about this symbiosis of these both formative and reformative properties, and we should all heed the bold declaration of the always right James Baldwin as we think about our children. And he says, "For these are all our children. We will all profit by or pay for what they become." These words are at the entrance of the family court here in Manhattan. You will not be in a place of higher education if you enter through those doors. We need to think about that as we talk about this overall institution and what it purports to do and what it fails to do. Thank you.
When I started the PhD program in urban education almost 5 years ago, I walked into my first class with a cohort of first-time PhD students. I immediately felt the imposter syndrome, a term I came to learn about while being a graduate student, and one commonly felt by so many. I'd applied to a round of programs 2 years prior, and was either rejected or never heard back. But it was okay, because at the time I didn't have a clear research goal, so instead I got a job teaching in colleges. It turns out that my master's program had prepared me for a little outside of academia. So with only a bit of experience as a TA, I delved into teaching as many courses as I could pack into my week. By the time I wanted to apply again, a couple of years later, I'd become immersed in a world of teaching that turned my attention to pedagogy in higher education, and especially my students, students of color and first-generation college students. The entire first semester, I was plagued with the feeling that perhaps I'd been awarded this slot by some mistake. I wondered if I'd been waitlisted before the invitation for an interview at the GC. Luckily, mine was with Steve Brier, someone who would become my advisor and offer so much support. Nevertheless, the imposter syndrome would not be quieted with one relationship or another, because it lived deep in my body, as a woman, as an immigrant from North Africa, and as a person with a disability. My unease had nothing to do with my capacity for intellectual work. I was confident in my ability to take on rigorous coursework. It was rather the feeling of worthiness and belonging that I struggled with. It was the anxiety at the type of academic performance I saw others excel at, for which I felt totally inequipped. For example, the so-called elevator pitch, eloquently crafted in academic language. The dexterity with which seemingly put-together doctoral students worked in metaphors that included Sophocles or made casual reference to Marxism. The very idea of writing as labor. I quickly found that I was not alone. I learned this through many conversations with my peers, other doctoral students of color from all walks of life. 2 years into the program, I had my aha moment. As I was sitting in the Graduate Center library with a friend, looking out through the giant glass partitions that separated the GC from Fifth Avenue. "This place was not made for us," she said. This statement resonated and captured what many of my peers disclosed through many conversations. I imagined that on the other side of the glass partition, it might have seemed like we had made it, and we did in many ways. We were on the inside of the ivory tower. We'd had enough social capital, academic know-how, and various degrees of support to get here. Yet, in one way or another, doctoral students of color continue to struggle with the experience that this place was not made for them. At its most basic, my research dives into this quandary. What I began to realize is that the matter was deeper than the feeling of imposterdom. The imposter syndrome is a mask that obscures the more complex and troubling reality of working and studying in these places. As a person with a mobility disability, navigating the sometimes unforgiving terrain of New York City, I understand at an embodied level what it means that a place was not made for you in mind. With disability, in some ways, it's more concrete. There's no ramp, no elevator, you could put your finger on it. But with race, it's often elusive and porous. So I started a project as part of my dissertation in the summer of 2016 through to 2017. I conducted interviews with 9 doctoral students of color, mainly African American and Latinx folks who answered the call. My broad line of inquiry into their educational histories, experiences with race in the classroom and other parts of their identity, and what their work as doctoral students helped bring me even closer to formally theorizing what it means to inhabit a space not made for you. As interviews unfolded and I listened back to the recordings, the most compelling discussion that kept coming up was the transformative experiences that my interviewees had when they encountered texts that reflected them. One person lit up as she recalled her discovery of an entire library wing consisting of Puerto Rican literature at Hunter College. For another, it was Afrofuturism, a theme she now integrates into her English comp courses as well as part of her dissertation. How do we go next? Okay. The requisite to earning a doctoral degree is mastering foundational knowledge and disciplinary discourse. From the humanities to the hard sciences, students must be versed in the canon of literature that the academy deems the standard, the basis from which all other knowledge builds. In art history, these vessels of knowledge are called old masters, but these figures exist across disciplines. Our Rembrandts, our Foucaults, our Derrida, our Freuds. Indeed, great works that are deserving of attention and study. But what we must also contend with is that these old masters, often representing white male and Anglo and Euro-centered epistemologies, are bodies of knowledge produced from social positions of privilege. Continuing to privilege these voices of knowledge at the expense of voices and perspectives of those who have stood at the margins is a serious problem in the academy, one reproduced through doctoral programs at the level of scholarship and teaching. As doctoral students pursue their studies, simultaneously crafting their scholarship and developing a pedagogy, the conviction to disrupt problematic practices in education manifests in their work through a range of pedagogical practices. I have been fortunate to have so many conversations about how our instructors do that, especially as it relates to their own intersectional identities and lived experiences. For some, it is all about curating a reading list that exposes students to authors that have traditionally been left out of the syllabus. For others, it is inviting students to generate their own knowledge through creative works, original research, and for others, it is just about helping students find their voice. While our intellectual lives as scholars are well documented through the writing we produce, our work as university educators exist in silos and ad hoc networks of informal support and exchange. One of the reasons I love working at the Teaching and Learning Center here at the GC is that we get to do programming that offers holistic, responsive, and sustained support to GC students going out for the first time to teach. Our educators embark on teaching incredibly diverse student body, many who themselves become educators or go on to pursue advanced degrees. So the implications of teaching are far-reaching. As an institution that houses 36 doctoral programs, the GC functions as a powerhouse of teaching labor for the largest urban public university system in the US. Doctoral students on graduate teaching fellowships are receiving their first experience teaching, and most are doing so in context of diverse student populations across New York City. Others have taught at CUNY and other institutions for a number of years and juggle their professional adjuncting careers with their graduate work. GC students teach nearly 180,000 undergraduate students every academic year. Through my pilot interviews and the many conversations and collaborations on pedagogy workshops, panels, a collaborative teaching zine, and a focused inquiry group, I stripped down enormous questions about epistemology, pedagogy, scholarship, and our intersectional identities to two basic questions. How and why do our lived experiences as scholars of color shape how we approach the design and facilitation of our courses? Second, how do we practice self-care to sustain ourselves as we juggle the various forms of academic labor, especially teaching? I think these two questions can bring us closer to a discussion about the qualitative value of diversity, rather than simply looking at markers of access like admission rates and graduation rates. While those markers provide a partial profile of how universities can be an avenue for social mobility, these conversations illuminate the constraints and possibilities for social transformation and the many paths leading there. Thank you.
Good evening. I want to begin with this op-ed that was written by our colleague, Gail Mello, who's the president of LaGuardia Community College, kind of legendary community college president. She says, it's easy to teach America's elite. What's really hard is teaching America's top 100%. And that she stays awake at night thinking, who are we missing? And are we serving and doing the best job we can educating that top 100% once they're at our institutions? Some figures, approximately 18 million undergrads, 40%, over 40% now in community colleges, 40% work more than 30 hours a week. And as you know, at CUNY, you don't get a scholarship, the big state scholarships, unless you go to school full-time, even though you may be working 30 hours a week. Many of the students are not working one job for 30 hours a week, but 2 or 3 jobs at 30 hours a week. 25% work full-time and go to school full-time. 25% are over 25 years of age. 30% are first-generation college students, 24% low income, 25% face food and housing insecurity, 58% female students, 45% students of color, 0.4% at the Ivies, and I would say 95% of books about higher education and punditry about higher education is based on people who went to those, who are the 0.4%, who went to those schools and are writing for and about those students. I'm not a violent person, but my temper rises when I talk here about the coddling of the American students and young students today. Students today are not coddled at most of our universities, and certainly not at CUNY. This program that I founded here at the Graduate Center, the Futures Initiative, was partly designed to address the fact that the faculty at the Graduate Center are much older and whiter and more traditional in terms of disciplines than our graduate students, and those students are from much more elite backgrounds in general than the students they teach, the 180,000 students that they teach throughout CUNY. So one thing we do is we pair CUNY central line faculty with faculty who teach at the CUNY campuses, across the campuses. There's always some diversity issue, diversity representation in the team-taught courses. And we teach not only content, but how you translate your cutting-edge research to the undergraduates out at the CUNY campuses. The method we typically use is progressive engaged learning, which there's so many studies that show the more students take knowledge and can apply that knowledge, the more likely they are to be able to apply it to their lives once they graduate. This is a wonderful quote by the science fiction writer Samuel Delany. African-American writer, he was an A++ student at Bronx School of Science, did not go to college, ran, not walked to the East Village, was gay and really needed to be in the village in the 50s, and published his first novel at the age of 20. He did not enter a college classroom till he was in his 40s, and he thought this was going to be heaven. He thought going to college, he was teaching at Wesleyan, invited to teach at Wesleyan. He was already very eminent, and he thought everybody would have this craving for education. He asked a question on his first day at Wesleyan, and 3 students raised their hand, and most of us as academics feel really happy when we ask a question and 3 people shoot up their hands. Here's what Delany says. Don't you realize that every time you don't answer a question, you're learning something? You're learning how to take it, how to make do, glasses, with what you've got, and you're learning how not to ask for a raise. You're learning how to take it. That's not good. So from now on, whenever I ask a question, everybody's got to put their hand up. I don't care whether you know the answer or not. You have to put your hand up. I'm going to call on you, and if you don't know the answer, I want you to say nice and clear, I don't know the answer to that, Professor Delany, but I would like to hear what that person has to say, and we'll pass it on. I don't care whether you know or not. You need to teach people they are important enough to say what they have to say. We tend to think of people who come to our universities as having deficits. If you're not trying to learn something, if not knowing and going from a condition of not knowing to a condition of knowledge isn't not a deficit, but the goal and the mission of higher education, why bother? So one thing we do is often, for example, the class I'm teaching this semester, Mediating Race, teaching with an assistant professor, Raquel Gates, a brilliant assistant professor from CSI. And one thing we do is she does the content part, she's looking about representations of race in media, and I talk about, with our graduate students, how you could translate these concepts and these theories and ideas and histories to their undergraduates. Just yesterday, we had a wonderful example where a student in our class said, I just taught an essay on American culture in 1905, and my students were bored to death. And I don't know what to do. And as a class, we came up with a method I'm pretty excited about. For her midterm exam, she's going to be asking students to interview the oldest person they know. Before they go into the interview, thank you. Before they go into the interview, they're going to talk as a class about that article, about history, about the figure in 1905, and figure out all the kinds of questions that historian asked in order to write an article. And so they go in, when they interview somebody, they're going to have a battery of excellent questions to ask. They're also going to write a head note giving the background of the person, which means they're going to be doing archival research, right? You know they're going to learn not just history, not just 1905, they're going to learn how to become historians, right? And they're going to learn how the meta, which we're terrible at higher education, why history matters, how history gives you a skill that you can apply to the rest of your life. You're taking data, you're taking a personal story, you're taking all kinds of information you're getting, and you're shaping into something you can then use to understand the culture you live in. It seems simple. Very, very rarely in higher education do we do that. And what we do know is these forms of taking education, taking the techniques of research and a research university and applying them in very specific ways is also key to retention, motivation, especially for students who feel like they have a deficit and who come from non-traditional, non-elite backgrounds. Thank you.
Well, everybody was incredibly quick and on time, and so we have a good deal of time for conversation among the panelists and also for questions from the audience. So what I'd like to do, if everybody can grab their microphones, the goal here is not to simply one at a time respond to a question I ask, but to engage in a dialogue with one another. So I'm going to throw out a question or two, and let's see where we can go with it. Richard talked about the distinction between public and private and the very nature of publicness, which I like. It's an interesting concept. So in that context, let me ask the question, is higher education an unalloyed public good that helps those who participate in it realize a more just and equitable society, or is it just about poor and working class students securing better access to the changing job market, which is a heavy emphasis on politicians and business people in terms of the way they think about what public higher education is about? I wonder if people could sort of engage that question in whatever order you wish.
I'm happy to jump in.
Jump, please.
I just refuse the opposition. I mean, when my colleagues who are academics say, well, we can't just give into this utilitarian notion that college is to get a good job, I say, well, didn't you go to graduate school, and wasn't that to prepare you to get a good job? I mean, it seems like, yeah, that should be a factor. But what we know from the Google studies of its workforce, from so many studies, is in fact having those higher order kinds of thinking, so-called soft skills, in fact, makes you not only a better parent. There's many things that correlate together. One of my friends likes to say, healthy, wealthy, and wise actually do tend to go together. Not the sense that wealth, but the more advantages you have, the longer life expectancy you have, the better medical treatment. There's a whole range of benefits that go along with being more educated that are both practical but also intellectual and open worlds for students.
Well, at the risk of just repeating some of what I said, I do think I agree it's a false choice. But I think institutions of higher education need to be intentional about the way they're serving the public, especially if they're a public institution, and to be clear about that. So it may well be that one institution is serving the public through the quality and impact of its research, and I use both those words, quality and impact, deliberately. And another one may actually isn't a research-intensive institution, but is doing a very, very good job of preparing those from lower-income backgrounds. I think what we shouldn't tolerate is institutions that are public or quasi-public, who are really doing neither. And there are some institutions that aren't performing very well in terms of access and upward mobility, and they're not really producing particularly high-quality research, and they're taking billions of dollars of our money. And at that point, I think you have to wonder whether that's money well spent. And so there are different ways to be public serving, but I do think you should be trying to tick at least some of those boxes if you're going to take public dollars in any shape or form, whether that's a break on your endowment or whatever.
It strikes me that, however, that sort of the burden tends, or the weight tends to fall towards the functional side of this these two questions, in the ways in which the larger society, the emphasis on STEM, the ways in which higher education is seen as a ticket to a better job. It's always been that at some level, but I think what we've lost, particularly in the public side of this, is the notion that goes back to the very origins of common schooling in the United States, the idea that education, and now even higher education, is educating people for citizenship in the broadest sense of the term, the critical thinking idea. And I think one of the obligations we have in higher education, especially public higher education, is to argue vigorously against the narrowly instrumentalist way in which higher education is perceived by those who fund it, particularly in state legislature. Go around the country now, it's an awfully depressing thing to see departments of philosophy, sociology, classics being eliminated because they don't directly relate to, as legislators see it, to getting better jobs. And I think that's a kind of critical question. Anybody else? So let me talk to, ask a question about something that Carla raised. Can we expect a college education to help break the carceral continuum, as Carla has described it? And if so, what needs to change in the structures and functions of higher education systems, and I would suggest also pedagogy, to make it possible for students of color to succeed in undergraduate and graduate studies? I mean, how do we get to that point, and what needs to be done?
This is such an important conversation, and I think moving through the idea of studying an educational pipeline, or how one moves through their foundational education in elementary and secondary school to even see college as an option. And what worries me is that we have, multitudes of ways in which young people are not served at those earlier ages to be ready for college. And we have to really put resources and attention on the front end of this if we want to do something at the later stages. And I think the idea of having a pipeline of talent and all of these things that we do, we're always analyzing the outcomes without putting so much scrutiny on the inputs and the front end. And I was thinking about this as someone talked about reentry from prison and those people who get educations in prison. And I said, well, what education were they getting before they ended up in prison? Can we put more emphasis on that so we don't have to, not even redo what you should have done, but do it the first time?
Can I add something on that? Because it struck me as well, the carceral continuum, and two thoughts occurred to me. One is that we focus very much on students being ready for college, so you get college readiness measures. Sarah Goldrick-Rabb has a very nice phrase where she says, instead we need to start thinking about student-ready colleges. Because the truth is you're always going to get students coming with different backgrounds, et cetera. And the idea that, and I think very often academics tend to sort of fold their arms and say, well, it's not our fault, they're not ready. It's the K-12 system or whatever. I'm happy to teach kids that are ready, they're just not ready. Well, I'm afraid that's an indulgence, and that actually we do need to have student-ready college, which meets students where they are, with the commitments that they've got, with the complex lives that many of them have. And the second thing is just a straightforward thing about policy. I think this is still true. I never forget my shock when I discovered it for the first time, which is that if you have a drug crime, you're ineligible for Pell support. It is very difficult for me to think of a stupider or crueler social policy, frankly. First of all, it breaks the whole principle that you don't bleed punishment from one domain across to another. And secondly, actually, it seems to me that people who might have had a drug crime at some point might be the ones who most need and benefit from education. So to explicitly rule them out from financial support, that's still on the books, and that's a result of the war on drugs. Right?
That's the federal grant.
The federal grant, still, but it's like, I'll stand by it, stupid and cruel. Because it's kind of doubling down. And so there are some policy things we can do as well as some of the kind of identity things that you really strongly talked about.
Sakina, you want to?
Oh, I just wanted to add, it's not just Pell, but food stamps, housing, anything that's going to actually help you reintegrate into society you're excluded from. So that's why the recidivism rate is so high.
What was so depressing, in the aftermath of the students' fight for open admissions in 1969 was the large number of CUNY faculty members who rejected the idea that it was their responsibility to make college accessible to students who were coming in, students of color. That's why the SEEK program was such an important development and why it was a kind of model, because it, in effect, took students where they were and said, what do we need to do to help them succeed in college, not simply trash the public school system. And for those who don't know, you know, there's the New York City public schools, 1.1 million students, 70% of those who graduate high school and go to college end up going to CUNY campuses, community colleges and senior colleges. So the link between New York City public schools and New York City's municipal colleges, CUNY, is a profound and deep and established one. And yet, in some ways, much of the attention of politicians and philanthropy in the society tends to focus on K-12, and very little of it focuses on public higher education. And that's something we need to sort of think about. Carla, did you want to say something about that?
I mean, it almost sounds, we always want to think of, you know, what is the apex of, you know, our society. It is getting this college education. It is finding a good job. And again, you know, you say the policy attention may be on K through 12, but, you know, educational policy is all these things that Sakina just mentioned, and Jean Anion's book, like what counts as educational policy? It is housing, it's economics, it's all these welfare things. So I think we may be, you know, almost saying the same thing, but if we understand the foundations, how can you really evaluate outcomes if you're not understanding the inputs? And another crazy policy example out of Chicago was when Rahm Emanuel said that students would not be able to graduate high school unless they had already signed up for the military, gotten a job. So you, again, are putting the impetus on an outcome, and you're totally forgetting about what gets someone to that point of finishing school. So these silos have been broken in a way that is negative, instead of considering the kind of cumulative advantage or disadvantage we can get as we look across the boundaries of housing, you know, with schooling, with criminal justice policy even.
You know, I'm sure we could go on and on. I have many other questions, but I'd like to give the audience a chance to ask questions. And what I'd ask is stand up, identify yourself. Oh, and there's a microphone. So please keep it to questions rather than lengthy statements, because we only have about 15 minutes. Thank you. Anybody? First one, take it first. There's a couple of people on this side.
My name is Larry, and you're all talking about graduate school and college. My feeling is that the problem in education is in K-12. That if you want to transform college, you have to address the problems in K-12. That's my experience. And the problem I see there is in standardization. We test these kids like crazy, or as I like to say, this is where you should be. And I find it does tremendous collateral damage. If you talk to special ed teachers, they go crazy with this. This is where you should be. I'm not there, therefore I'm a failure. So I find the testing industrial complex that we've created is the real problem in not just in K-12 and in college and in graduate school. We graduate far too many students who are not, what we say, college ready. So I would like to know how all of you feel about this testing mania that we have, that I find does tremendous damage.
Hate it. I mean, we know that test scores correlate so closely with income, with test preparation and income. It's a bogus measure. I've done a lot of work on the history of standardized testing, which was invented basically in 1917, quote unquote, by Frederick Kelly, who's dealing with an immigrant crisis. Too many people are coming into the United States, there aren't enough teachers, high school's required. He says standardized testing should be to test lower order thinking for, it's not a phrase I would use, I'm quoting, lower order thinking for the lower orders. And now that's become the measure of, if you look at one of Kelly's tests, it looks, in 1917, it looks like a GRE or an SAT right now. It's a very, very poor way of testing knowledge, and it makes a lot of money, for testing operations.
We can even think about the climate. This sets up for young children. You know, you're talking about K through 12, so you can hear about the, success academies and how there's something about having this rubric, but you've taken away the joy of learning. And what I'm interested in is what climate are we setting up for one to have a love of understanding the world and having a curiosity, but it's so disciplined and it's so controlled that you really take out the meaning of it truly, where people begin to resent the space and resent the climate, and it changes the school culture as well as the school climate to the detriment of the students.
Okay, I think it has to fall to me then to be in favor of testing, because someone in the room has to be. Clearly it can be misused. Clearly it can be too narrow. But I think the idea that we shouldn't be testing what people are learning, finding ways to evaluate it, and trying to close the gaps in what people are learning, which is where it can sometimes go. And I'll tell you that from an equity point of view, what tends to happen when we retreat from the idea that we should actually be checking that people are learning and progressing is that the kids from affluent, well-educated backgrounds continue to learn and progress. And actually, so it doesn't have, getting rid of testing doesn't necessarily have equitable outcomes. In fact, very often it contributes to inequity, because then it's much more about soft skills and who you know and how to play the game and so on. So used well, good tests can be a force for equity. And I think we can't just fall into the trap of saying tests bad, especially when it comes to an educational institution, and especially when so many educational institutions do have to have some test for getting in. Unless every educational institution is going to become open access, which maybe we can discuss, then actually thinking about what that selection criteria is the right question to have, rather than saying there should be no criteria.
Yeah, but I would suggest that testing, given how it's been defined and used since the early 20th century, it's been a declension, and it's never changed. It's always lower order evaluation. It's never intended to do what I think you're calling for, Richard, which is a real evaluation of what students are learning and how to improve that learning. There are metrics, or at least qualitative ways to do that, but because they're reduced to quantitative measures, think of IQ tests, which was another great, crime committed, on poor and people of color throughout the 20th century. It was the same thing. It used that exact same function. And the university was complicit. Sociologists were complicit in the ways in which those tests were used to measure success or not. So I think it's a question of sort of what gets tested and how it's tested, as much as a question of testing at all. Now it's high-stakes testing, and everything be damned other than what you get on a numerical number or grade. Let's have another question if we can.
Hi, I'm Sandy Cooper. I've taught college for 55 years and retired from CUNY a few years ago. A fact and then a question. In the middle of the 1980s, an administrator at the central administration here told me that open admissions benefited more poor white students than any others. Those kids who could perhaps dug up the money to go to some third-rate college, I won't name the places, came to CUNY, our enrollment exploded, and the majority of those who actually seem to have come out with a real, well, David Lavin's statistics in his book show it, about the first generation of open admission students. But I really wanted to focus on the equality issue at the graduate school. When this place was created in 1962 or 3 in the charter, it was, if I recall correctly, it was established in order to give people an opportunity to do graduate work who couldn't go to NYU or Columbia, who never could come up with that kind of money, and the public scholarships from the federal government really didn't reach them. In the last, 5 years or something, the idea that the place should exist for part-time students who work during the day has been totally closed down, as far as I recall, happened when I retired. And the handful of kids are, not kids, young adults are admitted to the doctoral programs, given full financial support as much as it works in New York City, under new circumstances than existed when I first started teaching here, maybe, 25 years ago. We had part-time students who finished. it seems to me that if one reads the original charter for this place, that this new policy is a violation of what the city agreed to. It was then the city, now it's the state. I think that's you made.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you. Let me respond to a couple of things, and others can chime in. I would say on the first instance, it is true that open admissions, particularly in the early 1970s, had a positive effect not only on students of color, blacks and Puerto Ricans, who entered CUNY in larger numbers than they ever had. That's absolutely correct. But it also had a positive effect on ethnic white students, largely Italian and Irish students, who previously could not get into CUNY senior colleges because of and even community colleges. It was a high bar even to get into the few spaces in CUNY community colleges in the 1960s. The system opened up in general in a way, and what happened is it expanded from about 110,000 students in 1968-69 to 250,000 students by 1972, the number essentially where we're at right now. That's an extraordinary expansion. Those are not all students of color, though they did constitute about 30 to 35% of the total population of CUNY, even though they were like 15 or 20% all told before 1969. But white students of working class background got in, and that was one of the ways in which CUNY was transformed in a fundamental way. This issue of part-time, I haven't been at this institution as long as you. I've only been here 40 years, and I do remember that, in effect, we used to have part-time students, and I think there was a trade-off here. One of the problems with part-time students, we created opportunities for them, but what, as I recall, many of them didn't finish or took a very long time to finish their dissertations, and that was a problem because we had limited financial support. So our institution came closer to the standard operating procedure for graduate schools across the city and the country in providing fellowships. So we shrank the number of doctoral students. I mean, one of the striking things to me is we've gone from about 4,200 doctoral students to about 3,200 doctoral students now in a relatively short period of time, and I think that is one of the downsides or negative effects of that development. I'd be interested to see what others think or feel about this. Anybody? Okay, one more question. Let's take one on this side. Yes.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you.
You.
Oh, me?
Oh, you have the mic.
I have
sorry.
the mic, but I'm happy to
Didn't
pass
see
it
you.
on.
I didn't see you. It's fine. Go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Christina Chalka-Eller. I'm a graduate student at Columbia University in the sociology department. So I've been thinking a lot about this issue of accountability in higher education. We've been talking about testing and standardization in the K-12 world, but I want to think more about, if our goal is to help shift some of the responsibility to higher ed institutions when it comes to producing both better student experiences and student outcomes, how do we avoid this conundrum of calling out the colleges that are doing really poorly if those are really the only options available for students in a particular geographical area because of cost constraints, because of just access and any number of other issues that, Bronx Community College is where I can go, so that's that. I don't mean anything about BCC, it's a great institution. But how do we deal with calling out colleges on what they're not doing right while still providing some opportunity for students to go to college in the first place, is the question.
Well, I certainly don't think we should back away from the idea that there should be some accountability. We saw that at the end of the Obama administration towards for-profit colleges, for example, who were being called out when they were not working or they were, quote, doing poorly. But I think a couple of things. One, we have to be very thoughtful about what we mean by doing poorly. And we have to be aware that whatever metrics we've got, we don't fall into the trap of just saying, well, because we can measure that, like the things I showed, quintile transitions, we'll make it that, right? And then, so it's first of all, what are the measures? Because if you open up your doors, if your access rates get better, then your graduation rates will almost certainly go down. So let's not have false measures that create false incentives. And then secondly, the real question is why? So you take Baltimore City Community College, current graduation rate of 6%, I think, which is the one that a lot of kids who grew up in Baltimore would kind of automatically kind of go to. What do we do with that information? What do we do? The graduation rate's low, the student quotes success in terms of earnings is not very good. What do we do with that information? And I think what we should do with that information is to say, how can we do better? Why is this institution over here doing better than that institution? Are there lessons that can be learned across it? So we shouldn't back away from the idea of looking, because otherwise what we do is we stop looking at the institutions that are serving the kids that most need a high quality education and stop trying to figure out whether they're getting it because it's difficult politically. And that is fine for all of those of us who are going to be in other institutions, but it is not fine for those kids who are going to them. And so what I'm really worried about is the drive against accountability and testing actually makes matters worse, because the institutions that most need to be held accountable, in the positive way that I've just tried to say, are very often the ones who are serving the kids that most need a good education. So we just can't back away from it. It's not good enough for those of us who won't be hurt by that to back away from it because it seems like the easier thing to say.
I think one answer is also teaching. In academia, teaching is not really rewarded. It's like, what did you publish? How frequently did you publish this publish or perish environment? But there's so little attention or support or kind of any value system put on developing your pedagogy. And I think that's maybe a part of the problem on a kind of more micro level, but then if you think about the fact that this is how doctoral programs train students, if you think about the sciences, they're like, don't worry about teaching, just go into the lab, or just kind of focus on your research rather than taking pedagogy very seriously, because it is a mechanism of social reproduction, and we don't really think of that when we kind of like craft our syllabus and go in and just kind of like impart our knowledge.
Yeah, I agree completely that we have to have accountability standards, but I don't think those are standardized standards. I'm very impressed, for example, by CUNY's ASAP program, which looks at what my colleague Candace Chu says, not students, but the people in our classrooms who are students, looks at their whole life circumstance, and is geared for such things as short-term loans, so that you don't have to drop out of class when your Pell Grant doesn't come, don't have to drop out of school when your Pell Grant doesn't come, and you have a choice to make between feeding your kids or paying the rent and staying in school, or offering classes that work with a normal teaching schedule or a work schedule. One thing we find at the Futures Initiative for our undergraduate mentoring program, almost all of our classes, professionalization classes, are Friday nights, because that tends to be a time when people don't have classes and don't work. Those are things that you can do that actually support students and do demonstrably change the graduation rate. ASAP has had astonishing results by attending to the people in our classrooms who are students and thinking there's many other things, cohort models, food pantries, advising, really pointed, careful advising. There are a number of things that you can do that in fact do lead to motivation, to continuation, to higher graduation rates. But those are I think it's very specific to know who those students are and meet students where they are.
So the ASAP program is a great example because it's doubled the graduation rates of community college students at CUNY. For those of you who don't know what ASAP is, it's an accelerated program to allow students to get through community college. Our biggest problem, time to degree, is abysmal. It's not quite at 6%, but it's not much better than that. What ASAP does is double that, and it doubles it largely because it's smart and it's strategic, but it also puts money in place. It needs funding. It needs, and it's a program that, rather than the lousy Excelsior scholarship program that our current governor put forward, which is a scandal and a sham, which I can go on about at great length, precisely because it measures the wrong things and, in effect, encourages traditional notions of who college students are. You're 18 to 22, you go to college for 4 years, you take 30 credits, and then you graduate in 4 years. That's not our student demographic. We have students who are older, who are married, who have families, who have to work, who have, serious financial problems. A huge percentage of our students come from families with less than $30,000 in income, the vast majority, and are often food insecure, all the things that we've just talked about tonight. So ASAP is a program that responds to that, and it puts our money where our mouth is in terms of saying, what do we need to do for our students to be successful? Those are the kind of programs that need to be replicated, it seems to me. I guess we have to stop there, but thank you very much. Thanks to the audience.